Hey there. I am excited to be here with my good friend, Rob Hampton. Rob has a good amount of experience in the e-commerce world, selling with a couple of different business models. So if you've thought about private labeling or you're growing a private label business or you've thought about wholesaling or you're just curious what the difference is between the two, Rob's going to be able to tell us a little bit about that. And Rob and I actually have known each other for about a year and a half. We've been in a mastermind together. So about every month or so, we've been meeting together just to talk about stuff. And I can vouch that Rob, he definitely knows his stuff. I've learned quite a bit from Rob over the last year and a half. So hopefully you will too. So first off, Rob, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks so much, Kevin. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, first off, why don't we just jump right into, for those of you or for those that are listening in, that, they're, why don't I just word this differently? Why don't we just start off? Tell us a little bit about your journey in e-commerce and what you've learned along the way so far.
Yeah, definitely. So I got started in e-commerce about 3, maybe close to 4 years ago now.
Okay.
And it was actually totally by accident. I was just kind of looking for some sort of side business, and my dad was running a side business selling, basically doing retail arbitrage on eBay. And he had actually taken the retail arbitrage model to a wholesale model, and he'd contacted the manufacturers and he was working with them, but he was running into some issues with MAP pricing. And if you're not familiar with MAP, it stands for minimum advertised pricing. And it's basically an agreement that a brand and a reseller make together, that the reseller will not advertise it for too low of a price because it kind of degrades the brand, creates unfair competition, and in the long run, everybody loses.
Right.
But unfortunately, my dad was running into an issue where a bunch of the products that he had purchased, everybody was just killing him on MAP, and he didn't want to violate the agreement. So he said, hey, Rob, why don't you take this and you can sell it yourself and just reimburse me the original pricing of it, sell it on Amazon and see how that works for you. And so I bought a couple overstock products for my dad, expecting that, hopefully I would sell them over the course of a few months and make a couple $100. And I ended up, if I remember right, selling through everything within the first 2 weeks, which was much faster than I expected. So that obviously got me pretty excited and interested in Amazon. And so I started studying it like crazy. I would listen to, 10 to 20 hours a week of podcasts, read every blog I could, and really just dove into Amazon and ended up starting my own wholesale business through that. And with wholesale, basically how that works, or at least how it worked for me, is picking a niche and then contacting manufacturers within that niche and saying, hey, I would like to sell your product. Here's how I'm going to represent it. Here's where I'm going to sell it. And I think I had a little bit of insight into this because my background is all in music. So I worked for a couple larger music companies as well as some large music retail stores, like Guitar Center being one of the larger. And so I kind of saw from the inside a lot of the wholesale model, but just not applied in an e-commerce context. So I was able to take my experience outside of e-commerce and learn e-commerce so I could apply that wholesale experience in the e-commerce context.
Okay, cool. So you had a business and you're selling wholesale. So for people that aren't really familiar with the difference between like wholesale and private label, like what is really the key distinction if someone's listening to someone say, okay, here's my business model? What were those key things they'd be like looking to hear? They say, oh, that's wholesale versus own brand.
Sure. So let's say you go to Cabela's. Cabela's is an outdoor sports and camping store, right?
Okay.
And you go there and you see a, let's see, what's a big brand of tents? Can't even think of one right now.
Let's just call one Outdoor XYZ.
Yeah, you see Outdoor XYZ, and they're being sold at Cabela's. They're probably being sold at Target. They're being sold at REI. They're all over the place.
Sure.
You could get a hold of Outdoors XYZ tents and say, hey, I am a licensed reseller. Obviously, you need to be a licensed reseller. Go get
Okay.
your resale license, which is very easy. And then you can sell their products anywhere. Now, the difference between that and private label is if you go to Cabela's, you'll probably also see a Cabela's branded tent. Now,
Okay.
Cabela's does not make tents. Cabela's is a huge retail store, right? But what they've
Gotcha.
done is they've gone to contract manufacturers, generally located in China, but not always.
Okay.
And they said, hey, we like these tents that you're making for these other guys. Can you make some changes and put our name on it? That's kind of basic private labeling. And so Cabela's is going to private label their own stuff. Whereas Outdoor Tents XYZ, they may also be private labeling it, they may not, but you as a wholesaler are buying from them. And so Cabela's, for example, is a wholesaler. They are buying from Outdoor XYZ, but they also private label by going directly to the manufacturer and getting Cabela's tents.
Gotcha. Now, what are some of the differences in like profit margins, for example? Because if you have, um, you know, if you're going directly to the manufacturer, but if you're buying from someone else in between, there must be some level of difference in margins.
Yeah, so there's no like guaranteed rule of thumb. It's going to vary based on the quantity and based on the size of the manufacturer and brand, right?
Hmm.
But the typical wholesale pricing uses what's called keystone pricing. So if the retail price is $100, keystone pricing is 50%. So it's going to cost me $50.
Got
I'm
it.
gonna I'm gonna buy that tent for $50 and I'm gonna resell it for 100. Now, general rule of thumb is going to be like a 200% markup. So for
Okay.
the retail brand, so the brand that's selling it to me for 50, so that I can sell it for 100, probably bought it for 25, or it cost them 25 to make it through their contract manufacturer.
Got it. Got
Now
it.
that's going to vary also based on the size of seller that you are. Lots of different wholesalers will work out different levels. So you could be a regular dealer level, you could be a power dealer, or you could be a distributor level.
Hmm.
And a very small dealer level, generally more of a mom and pop shop
Okay.
setup, you're probably, you're not going to get traditional keystone pricing. You're probably going to get closer to 20 to 30%. Whereas a distributor pricing where you're buying hundreds and hundreds at a time, you should be looking for closer to traditional keystone of 50%.
Now, when you say 20-30%, you mean like basically 20-30% discount off of the retail
Uh, um,
map pricing or whatever?
yes, yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So basically your margin would be about 20-30% of whatever the
Exactly.
selling price is. Um, okay. So what you described in a lot of ways for, I think if everyone can imagine the cereal aisle, if you buy Kellogg's cornflakes, it's going to be more expensive than say Publix or Kroger or whatever your local grocery store is, their brand of cornflakes or whatever they call it. It may not be infringing on the name of that cereal,
Yep.
but you pay less for it. But that makes sense because, as you have more um, people in the mix from the time it's manufactured, or more entities in the mix before it gets to the end consumer, more people are slicing up the pie, so to speak. So that would explain why the margins tend to be better in private label. I'm sure for even the store, even if they're selling it at a lower price because it's their brand and they're doing it directly. So when you were doing wholesaling, what were some of the pitfalls that you ran into um, with selling wholesale products, which is someone else's brand?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest pitfall is potentially equally its biggest strength right now, just depending on the level of effort you want to put into it. The
Okay.
biggest pitfall is really that it is super, super easy to start a wholesale business and sell stuff online.
Right.
So all the manufacturers or the brands out there, when I come to them and I say, hey, I want to sell your stuff, he says, where are you going to sell it? Oh, online. 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, no, thanks. We don't need more e-commerce sellers because it doesn't
Mm,
help them, right?
right.
They're not going to all of a sudden sell more products just because you started buying from them in addition to another wholesaler.
Right.
It can actually be worse for them to have more people, because then guys start fighting on map and driving the prices down.
Mm.
However, that can also be your biggest strength if you are going to do more than just the easy way of reselling. So what I ended
Okay.
up doing that worked out really well for me is having put so much effort into learning Amazon and e-commerce specifically. I
Hmm.
went to these brands and I didn't just represent myself as a wholesaler. I represented myself as an Amazon expert and said, hey, so here's what it looks like when all these guys sell your stuff on Amazon. Here's what it looks like when I sell your stuff on Amazon. I optimize the images. I optimize the title, bullets, and description. I do extensive keyword research. I do pay-per-click advertising. And all of those costs will be on me, not on you. And no other wholesaler is going to do this for you. And then I would wait for their response based on that.
Okay. So that would generally work pretty well, because I would imagine, because most people are probably just throwing it up there and fighting over the buy box. So for anyone that's
Exactly.
more familiar with private label, you have your own brand, and theoretically you should be the only seller because you're the one that's getting the product um, from the manufacturer. So unless somebody got one as a gift and they threw it up there to sell it, no one should be selling a new version of your product, um, at least not profitably. But
Yeah.
with retail arbitrage and with wholesale, you're competing for the buy box. So what
Yep.
would be some things you would do? Because if you're, instead of just competing with yourself for the buy box, you're probably competing with, sometimes 20, 30 or more other sellers. How do you make sure that you would get the buy box?
So the buy box algorithm is kind of this great Amazon mystery. The few things
Right. If
that
we
we
all
do
knew.
know. Yeah, exactly. Somebody could give me that info. I'd be very rich very quickly. But what we do know for sure is price affects it, which
Okay.
is why guys will start competing on price.
Hmm.
We also know that your seller feedback history affects it.
Oh,
So if
gotcha.
you have, and I think it's generally within, and honestly, this could have totally changed. It's been close to 2 years since I've really focused on this business model, but
Okay.
it used to be within 10% was going to really affect you. So if somebody had 100% feedback and somebody else had 91, and you both had the product at the same price, you would generally rotate in and out of the buy box pretty equally.
Okay.
However, if the other guy was at 90%, you you would generally get the buy box more. That at least is how it used to be.
Okay.
And obviously, if somebody had 80 or 70 or 60, they're going to get it a whole lot less, because Amazon looks at that and they say, "Huh, this seller doesn't seem to give people the best customer experience. If I have
Mm.
two options, I being Amazon, of who I'm going to give the customer to, I'm going to give it to the guy that I know is going to take good care of them."
Okay.
Now, another thing that plays into the buy box is going to be your fulfillment center and inventory locations. So, for
Mm.
example, you're over on the East Coast and I'm on the
Hmm.
West Coast.
Right.
If we are both selling the same pair of branded Nike shoes,
Okay.
and the buyer is in Idaho, I'm
Okay.
probably going to get the buy box. You're probably not.
And that's assuming we're both selling it fulfilled by merchant as opposed to fulfilled by Amazon.
No, fulfilled by Amazon.
Oh,
Right.
so
So
got it.
if my shoes are in the Boise, Idaho warehouse, that's
Okay.
where they got sent when I sent them in for FBA, and your shoes are in Washington, D.C., um, but the buyer is in Boise or Arizona or Las Vegas, somewhere closer, then Amazon's going to say, oh, it's going to be cheaper for us to send this product for this customer from this buyer. So let's put that buyer
Mm.
in the buy box.
Got it. Got it. So, and that's something you have no control over
Yeah, you have
necessarily.
zero control. Well, at least up front. One way that you can control it is by sending in smaller inventory shipments,
Hmm.
and it's more likely to get dispersed amongst more fulfillment centers that way. At
Oh,
least
okay.
that's how it used to be.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, okay. That all makes sense. So if if I was interested in getting into this model, you mentioned needing to be a licensed reseller. How does one go about getting a license from what you've seen?
Yeah, very easy. It's something you're going to do with your state. So I would just Google state name, reseller license, or
Mhm.
reseller permit. Different states call them different things, but it's super simple. Here in the state of Washington, I think it's like 50, maybe $60. It lasts a year. You tell them what sort of business you're doing and promise to pay taxes. And that's basically it.
Got it. Okay. So this is more so that you have a little more credibility when you're talking to, you know,
Yeah. So if you go
XYZ tent
to
company.
if you go to XYZ tent company and you say, I want to sell your products, and they go for it, they're
Hmm.
going to say, all right, so here is our standard dealer application. You're going to
Hmm.
fill out a dealer application, giving them all your info, and you're going to give them your resale license number. If you don't have a reseller's license number, they're going to have to charge you tax. Now, unless you want to pay an extra, whatever, 7 to 12%, depending on where
Right.
you live, you definitely want to have that reseller's permit.
Gotcha. Because otherwise you're getting taxes charged onto it, which just
Yeah.
eats into your margins because your margins are a little slimmer to begin with. Now, um, what would you say, generally speaking, when you were wholesaling, were the margins you were getting at the time?
My margins were so after Amazon fees or before?
Let's say after Amazon fees. So
Yep.
or maybe just if you could walk through somebody like, okay, if you have a pie and the pie is $100 and
Yep.
50 of it is going to pay for the product, what's left in the other 50?
Yeah. So I wasn't getting keystone pricing with the larger brands that I worked with, but I got it
Okay.
with a few of the smaller brands. So again, it's all like there's some negotiating that's involved. There's a lot of relationship building that's
Hmm.
involved, right? So some manufacturers, I met them in person at trade shows and we built a rapport, right? So I got better pricing. We'll say on average, if I bought something for $100, I, I'm going to resell something for $100. I probably bought it for about 75. And then Amazon, of course, is going to take roughly 15%. Then there's going to be their fulfillment costs.
Uh-huh.
So depending on what sort of pricing you work out with the brand, it can be fairly low margins. Like my take home margins were generally between 10 to 20% after all was said and done.
Gotcha. Okay. So large or lower than private label generally is.
Yeah.
Um, that makes sense because you're sharing part of the pie with someone else. So what was the reason you decided to, because you've used the phrase used to be,
Yes.
um, and I know you're still selling, and I know a lot of the story, but what made you decide to leave the wholesaling business?
Yeah. So it was a combination of capital and passion. So what I
Okay.
realized was I kind of fell into the business that I was doing
Uh-huh.
and I enjoyed it. But what I really enjoyed was the business part, not necessarily the products that I was selling.
Right.
And so I realized I really just wanted to focus on a product that I really cared about. I
Hmm.
didn't care about selling tents. Um, so I determined, okay, I want to get into some sort of private label. The more I had studied e-commerce, the more I had started hearing that term,
Hmm.
and the more I was learning about that. And so I decided, all right, I built up the wholesale business. I started it off with about $800 worth of inventory, and got it to the point that it was profiting between $2,000 and $3,000 a month. Not huge, not enough, at least in my area, to live on, but definitely a great side income. But I didn't have a whole bunch of money saved up to start my own brand because I was always reinvesting the profits. So
Hmm.
I decided the quickest way for me to start a brand that I was going to be really passionate about was going to be to sell the business that I'd started, take the money from that business sale, and put it all into a new business. And so that's what I did.
Nice. Now, do you mind sharing some of your experience of what it was like selling the business? Because sometimes we hear, people talk about the exit of selling an e-commerce business, but it's always interesting to hear from somebody that actually lived it.
Yeah. It was a huge learning experience. And looking back, like I enjoy looking back on it. I would
Looking
say,
back is fun.
yeah, looking back is fun. The process itself wasn't super fun. Now, some of that was my own ignorance and just having to learn in that process. And I think some of it is just that it's, it can be a lot of work and it can be a drag and it's not quite as fun as building something. But I would say some of the bigger things that I look back on that I learned big lessons in was bookkeeping. My bookkeeping was atrocious.
Mm.
And when I went to sell it, I had to get all of that in order so that the buyer could do proper due diligence.
Oh gosh.
And so I got it to work, but man, did it, suck the wind out of my sails as far as, oh, this is so cool. I'm selling a business. It's going to be so much
Right.
fun. It was like,
Just
no,
trust me.
let's
Everything's
stare at
fine.
spreadsheets for hours and hours.
Uh,
So that was definitely a learning experience that was not fun in the midst of it. I worked with a broker, and there were positive experiences with the broker and not so positive. One of the things that I struggled with was I really felt like um, if you think about a business broker in parallel to like a real estate agent,
okay.
I kind of felt like I was in a situation of I allowed the real estate agent to list my house on the MLS.
Uh-huh.
And normally, your real estate agent is going to show the house to people.
Right.
I felt like I was having to do the open houses all the time.
Oh,
I
okay.
was always having to get on Skype calls with potential buyers and walk them through the business model and explain everything. Now, some of that, it makes sense. Like the complexity of a business compared to a house is obviously much higher, and the broker's not going to know everything about the business. But I did feel like there was a lot of very entry level questions that I was having to regularly answer for buyers
Sure.
that the broker could have answered on my behalf and saved myself and the buyer a lot of time.
Got it. So in your experience, comparing that with what you've, I'm sure, shared with other people or heard from other people, is that pretty similar that you're having to not just using the real estate analogy of, you got the multiple listing service where, basically here it is on the internet for the house and, the realtor comes and brings people, that here you were having to spend more time answering those questions. Is that generally standard when you're selling the business?
So, from what I've been told by other brokers that I've befriended since then, it sounds like you definitely are going to have interaction with the buyers, but generally there should be a higher barrier to entry for that buyer,
Right.
where they're going to be a um, pretty educated buyer on your business before getting into it. So, for example, some of the questions that I was fielding were like, "What are your margins?" That's something that the broker should have been able to answer, right? We
Right.
should have had to schedule a Skype call for me to tell you, well, the margins vary depending on brand, between 15 and 30%. What I should have been having conversations with them about is, hey, what are some areas that you feel like are huge growth potentials? Where have you not
Mm.
taken the business well? In which case I would have said, hey, a huge growth potential is doubling down on inventory because I'm
Uh-huh.
running out of stock every month. So if you have more money than me, that's a growth potential.
Right.
And starting a website and having a really quality website is a growth potential because I had a website that it was very bare bones. It was really just built to make me look good to the brands that I was approaching,
Uh-huh.
not to get additional sales from. So those to me are conversations that are great to have with a buyer to help them determine should they buy this. Um, the less positive experience was how many questions that I got that were, hey, what are the margins? Hey, how many hours a week do you have to work?
Got it. So that's something that, and whenever you do something new, you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now that you know that, you would know, I guess, to go to the broker, if you're going to talk to a broker to sell, a business again in the future, you could always say, okay, what what questions do you need from me? Or you could even say, because now you've lived it, hey, here's a one sheet of the basic questions that you're going to probably get. So that way they can screen people out for you, I'm assuming. So you
Yep.
don't have to field all those questions. And then to your point, if people had, more questions or whatever, after at least getting through those filtering questions, and if then they got to you, then at least they're probably a more qualified, more interested buyer. How do you price a business?
Yeah, so that's, I will preface this as most like tax guys do.
Right. It depends.
Well, as far as like, I'm no expert.
Right.
I'm not a broker by any means, but I can tell you what I've typically seen.
Mhm.
So multiples are generally going to vary based on a number of factors. What sort of risks does this business have? If
Right.
it's super low risk, you're going to get a higher multiple. If it's
Mhm.
super high risk, you're going to get a lower multiple, right? That just makes sense.
Sure.
Now, your multiples are going to vary within that. Um, Within e-commerce, it tends to be between 1.5 to upwards of 3. I've seen some closer to 4, but you're talking, a very established brand that has low risk because they've diversified across a lot of channels. So I would say 1.5 to 3. But most people, especially if it's their first time doing this, they're probably going to be between 1.5 to 2. And
Okay.
now that multiple is based off profit. So for example, if my business is selling $1 million a year at 10% EBITDA, then it's going to be $100,000 profit, loosely said, and that's going to be a 1.5 multiple. So I could get $150,000 for the sale of that business.
Okay. Gotcha. And the definition of profit they use is EBITDA, the earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization.
Yep.
Okay. Gotcha. So, and I understand the concept of EBITDA, but if I had to calculate it, I would probably struggle. So it's definitely probably something to have an accountant look at, I would imagine, before
Yeah. Very
selling.
loosely said, you can look at your profit margins
Uh-huh.
and say it's going to be 1.5 times my yearly profit.
Gotcha. But putting back in some ways, the taxes, depreciation,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. If you work with a good broker, they're going to walk you through things like add backs. So basically, just because my business, like I profited, say $100,000, what we didn't take into account was I used my business credit card for a couple conferences, and I used my
Mm,
business credit card for my cell phone, and I, had the business pay for a number of different things that you as the buyer don't necessarily have to do. So I can add those back in to my profit because they weren't something that the business depended on to
right.
succeed. Right now, spending $10,000 on marketing, I couldn't add that back in because that
Right.
$10,000 for marketing helped the business grow. My
Right.
cell phone, didn't help the business grow. I
Right.
needed it. I used it, but that's up to somebody else.
Yeah,
So
that makes
conferences is a better example as far as
yeah,
something being
that makes perfect sense, because conferences, it's one of those things, like, it's helpful for your business and your mindset and your growth and all that. But at the end of the day, um, if you didn't go, it doesn't have a direct reflection on the business. Whereas to your point, like, if you spent less on advertising, you would theoretically bring in less sales, and less sales would be less profit. So
Yep.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. So then you started getting into private labeling. So,
Yep.
um, what have you learned along the way with private labeling? And what would you say maybe are the pros and cons of private labeling now on the private label side versus wholesaling?
Yeah. So the pros and cons, honestly, yeah, wholesaling, to get into the wholesale game right now, I think you really really need to be an expert to set yourself apart. If you don't know whatever your channel, so like in my case, if you don't know Amazon like the back of your hand, and you
Uh-huh.
can't go to a brand and really show them that you are differentiated and that you're going to be able to help them sell more, it's just not worth getting into.
Gotcha.
And it's going to take a lot of work to do a good job at that, because Otherwise, there's just no reason for this brand to sell to you.
Right.
Private label, similarly, the past few years, e-commerce has been evolving rapidly. And it
Mhm.
used to be you could just go on Alibaba and find the famous garlic press and
Right.
stick your name on it and, you know, send it out to a bunch of people for free so that Amazon would think that you sell really well. And all of a sudden you're private labeling super successfully.
Mhm.
Nowadays, that's just, in my opinion, that's not the case. What you need to do is you need to really think about, okay, this is a brand and these products work together. And how can I put out a product that isn't the same thing that another guy that's going to that same contract manufacturer is putting out? How can you improve on it? How can you do 10 times better with your pictures, with your inserts, with your packaging, with your
Mhm.
copywriting, all of that stuff? Now, I would say one of the big differences between your private label model and your wholesale model with listings and all that is obviously you're doing everything when it comes to private labeling. You're going to do your pictures.
Mhm.
You're going to do your copywriting. Depending on the size of the brand, hopefully you are not having to do product photography for a brand that you're wholesaling, right?
Mhm.
Hopefully they're selling to retail stores and all this stuff. And so they have good product photography and you're just taking those photos and optimizing them, maybe making some infographics that work really well on
Mm.
Amazon or something like that.
Gotcha. So you have a little bit more control over the brand, which I always think is a positive. And the margins are higher on the private label side. To your point, it's not as easy these days to just take a generic product and say, "Oh, this is mine." Because I've helped some people out, and anytime they say, "Oh, here's this product I have," and I look on Amazon and I can see 10 products on the first page that all almost look like they have the exact same pictures, even.
Mm-hmm.
That's a recipe for disaster. So you have to create some way of creating your own brand, some sort of brand identity. Um, Kind of on that note, which we were talking about beforehand, that I thought was kind of funny was because you and I know each other and we familiar with our own brands. You had coincidentally gotten one of my products as a gift, what I thought was kind of funny. So
Yeah, that was pretty awesome.
yeah, and I would be even more shocked if I had gotten your product.
Yeah.
That double coincidence there. Um, but yeah, so if somebody was saying, okay, um, let's say they've established themselves now and they've got a private label brand, and they're saying, what, I want to expand as a private label brand and go off Amazon, because everybody that sells on Amazon has all these dreams and aspirations to have just as much sales elsewhere. But we've come to learn that even if it's just a small percentage somewhere else is actually a good thing. But some people think about, brick and mortar or something like that, um, or even just wholesaling it. What are some ways now that on the flip side of thing, if you were going to wholesale your private label product, something that's your brand that you control, so now you're on the opposite side of wholesaling of what we talked about earlier, what would be some things you would want to consider?
Yeah. So if I went to a retail store as a wholesaler, I would be very intentional, first off, about MAP pricing.
Okay. And that's the minimum
Again,
advertised pricing.
yep, exactly. Now that's going to do a couple things for me. One, it's going to make it so that if, let's say I get, 10, 20, 100 wholesalers, I don't just personally, I don't want the drama of one of them coming to me and saying, "Hey, Joe down the street is selling this for less than MAP, or he's
Mm,
selling it so low. How is he able to sell it that cheap? What are you letting him buy it for?" I just don't want to have those conversations, right?
gotcha.
I want it to be very clear out the gate. Here's the lowest price you're allowed to advertise this for. Now, if you want to sell it for more, have at it.
Sure.
If you want to run a coupon code and say, "Hey, 10% off for Black Friday," no problem. But I don't ever want to see that $99 MAP price drop to $98. So I would have that be very clear
Hmm.
in a wholesale agreement contract, that they will abide by MAP, and that if they break MAP one time, the relationship is done.
Gotcha.
Additionally, I would have uh, at least an Amazon non-compete set up where I would say, hey, in addition to having to abide by MAP, you are not allowed to sell on Amazon. Because if you
Sure.
start listing against me in the buy box, I'm just going to stop selling to you.
That makes
Now, if they
perfect
have their own
sense.
website, maybe I allow
Right.
them to sell on their website. Maybe I don't. We could talk that through.
And that makes sense because you were talking before on the flip side of it where you're the wholesalee, I guess. So you're receiving the wholesale product or you're buying the wholesale product. And that you have to provide some sort of value because, now that if you're the wholesaler and you're the one who's, selling the product at wholesale, um, you would want to make sure they're not competing with you. Because if you're not, competing with someone for the buy box, why are you all of a sudden selling at something that might be lower margins for you just so
Yeah.
now they can come in and cut your higher margin retail pricing, out of the woodwork. So yeah, that's a good point to make sure, if you're selling on Amazon that they can't sell on Amazon too, and that they can't go minimum advertised pricing. Um, how much, uh, how much work would it be to wholesale versus, we're all used to just shipping in boxes of product into Amazon. Those of us that sell private label anyway. Um, you know, would you envision there'd be more work than that on the wholesale side?
Yeah. So um, here's where we get into just new learning territory for me.
Uh-huh.
I can't say for sure. I'm just now venturing into this,
Cool.
where I've had a few different retail stores contact me and say, "Hey, we're interested in selling your product. Can you send us a price sheet?"
Uh-huh.
And so I'm trying to be really intentional, and I think this is different probably than maybe many brands that wholesale, but I'm trying to be really intentional to not set up a wholesale channel that takes a lot of my time because I
Mm-hmm.
just don't want to go down that trail. Um, I've worked for companies before that wholesale, and we had entire regional sales teams where this guy manages this team on the West Coast and all throughout the country, and they're going to retail stores and they're saying, hey, you should buy our product, you should stock it on yourselves, it'd be great for you. I
Sure.
don't want to do that. I want
Right.
to continue to be able to work from a coffee shop, have a couple VAs, and do everything with my laptop. So I'm not going to venture into that approach to wholesale, but the way that I'm hoping I can do it, and again, I haven't done it yet, so I might be naive and we'll see if it works out. But my goal is that I'll set up everything through my website and
Mm-hmm.
have a dealer portal where
Mm.
the dealer can log in and then they'll be able to get their discounted pricing. And then they just place an order through the website, just like any other customer would, except they get special pricing.
Right.
That is the only way that I'm willing to do wholesale, is if that's the level of effort that I have to put into it. And as far as reaching out to wholesale opportunities, that's also something that I'm not focusing on personally.
Mm-hmm.
The couple guys that have come to me, I'm entertaining it, but I'm not making cold calls to all the local brick and mortar stores and saying, hey, you should really carry this product. Because I feel like just 80-20 rule, it's better for me to be spending my time on e-commerce right now
Mm-hmm.
because I know I've not even come close to maximizing the potential there. And that's where my expertise is.
Yeah, that's a big thing because we all think like, oh yeah, I was selling stores, it's going to be great, but to your point, like there could be additional work, like having worked at places where we bought stuff from wholesalers. um, you know, there's an expectation pressure of not running out. So if all of a sudden you're running low, it's, oh my God, I need this fast. I need this fast. I need this fast. Can you ship this order in fast? And I could see how you'd run into a lot of that. And, oh, it'll be here at X time. They want to talk through it. I could see there being a lot of kind of hand holding.
Yep. I don't want to issue POs. I don't want to
Right.
do any of that. It's like, I
Right.
don't want to let you try and figure out terms with me.
Right.
No, if you want to buy it, I'll give you, pretty good margins, and you can place the order on the website, and you can even choose your shipping speed. So if you need it next day air, you can pay for that. And I've
Right.
got a fulfillment center set up, and they will next day air it to you. But I'm not going to spend an hour on the phone with you setting up a PO, doing
Right.
all this stuff, because I just feel like I will see more growth from my time being spent on e-commerce.
I definitely agree. And I've had a few people reach out to me here and there about working out some sort of wholesale arrangement on my products, and I've actually never had one come to fruition. The tip you had given me, actually, I think when we first met,
Yeah.
was making sure that there was the non-compete with Amazon. And usually when I say that, I never hear back.
There you go.
Yes. It's like, well, of course, no, I don't want you to compete with me there. Um, well, cool. So, just to kind of close this conversation off, which I think has been really helpful, and for anyone that's thinking about wholesaling, either side of the equation that we've talked about here, as the person buying wholesale or the person selling wholesale, um, just in general, what would you say if you were going to go back in time and talk to yourself early on in this, whether, when you first started selling in e-commerce, when you had those first orders on eBay that sold out in a couple of weeks, or, when you first started private labeling, at some place early in your e-commerce journey, what advice would you give to yourself that would propel you forward?
I'll give you two answers. So
Awesome.
I'll say, if I were to be able to go back 4 years, it was a different time.
Hmm.
And so if I had that time machine, I would just tell myself, double down, triple down, quadruple down on everything you're buying, because it's going to sell.
Right.
Nowadays, I think my advice would probably be focus on the things that move the needle
Mm.
more so than the things that are really easy. So, for example, I was just talking to a buddy the other day that's starting a business totally unrelated to e-commerce, but I could immediately see some similar mistakes that he was making, um, to what I did early on, which was focusing on little things like business cards.
Hmm.
You don't need to go get 500 business cards printed right now.
Right.
What you need to do is figure out your niche, figure out where you're going to source from,
Hmm.
and learn the skills that you need to be able to do this business model. You don't need business cards. You
Correct.
don't need, don't get ahead of yourself with thinking, okay, I need to set up click funnels and landing pages and all this stuff. If you're getting started, focus on the things that are going to move the needle right now, rather than the things that are going to move the needle once you've reached the, $10,000 a month point.
Very, very good advice, Rob. Very good advice. It's all about doubling down on what's most important. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share for those that are tuning in here, so to speak?
No, I mean, yeah, I think what I just said, focusing on what's going to move the needle, paying attention to your profit margins. And I guess lastly, I would say, do what I didn't and pay attention to your bookkeeping from a much earlier standpoint, or time point. And yeah, just have fun with it, because at least to me, it's a ton of fun.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I thank you so much for being here, Rob, and sharing very forthcoming with a lot of good information, which um, I'm sure will be helping some people here soon. So thanks so much for being on Maximizing E-commerce.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kevin. Have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thanks.